Good morning, everyone. This is an episode which will address tomorrow morning, Christmas Day. What was it invented for? This is explained by a theologian, Oxford teacher. He is named Frederick Cornwallis Conybeare. He's very famous in his day, and we'll show you some background in a minute. And we're going to basically review an article that he did entitled The History of Christmas. This is the full title, and it was from January 1899. And he basically contended as follows. Christmas was invented in the late 300s post-Nicaea to push out Epiphany holiday in early Christianity. So he finds that a problem, and we're going to show you now in the next slide what that means. The reason is Epiphany's Christological implications was that Jesus was a man begotten by God as his son at his baptism. That's exactly how it read in both Matthew and Luke. And both of those passages were in due time removed, probably right around 4 or 5 AD by Jerome. This mismatched. So why was it a problem? Because to say Jesus was begotten as Son of God at his baptism rather than in eternity past, where he's an eternal Son of God in the Nicene Creed, it happened at his baptism. And then it has other serious implications of how the church viewed that as for our salvation as well. Do we have to become disciples? And at age 30, do we have to then get approved to be baptized and things like that? Things like that you might not think about if you had these passages were restored as they originally were in the early church. Anyway, so let's begin. Give you a little background on this gentleman, Conybeare. These are all his famous works. Outlines of Philosophy of Religion, 1892, translator. The Armenian Apology and Acts of Apollonius and Other Monuments of Early Christianity, 1896. The Demonology of the New Testament, how demons are treated in the New Testament, 1896. The Contemplative Life, The Key of Truth, the Manual of the Paulician Church of Armenia, 1898. He seems to have a fascination with this Paul-only Christian group called the Paulicians, and this was, I think, a late 10th century group. They were a revival of Marcionism, and Conybeare shows signs that he is a Pauline fan from time to time. But being an objective person, he also is a very good theologian in terms of looking at the historical record, particularly when he was trying to look at when did Christmas have its first founding, and what was the reason for it, what was the effect of it, and what was the intent of it, and what did it push out, and what did it remove from Christian theology about Christ. He wrote on the Dreyfus case. He did other things, but this is interesting here. He wrote a book, a ritual. I won't go all the whole thing here. It's called The Greek Rites of Baptism and Epiphany, edited from the oldest manuscripts, 1905. So this is going to prepare him for this work. This 1899 work we're reading here will prepare him to do this work in 1905. So he was really focusing a lot on Epiphany, which again is a Christian holiday that existed approximately about January 6th for multiple centuries in the very earliest church, as he'll explain. Now, I just want to show you one other thing. We talked about this when we excerpted this book recently. One of his best-known works is Myth, Magic, and Morals from 1909, later issued under the title The Origins of Christianity. This has been read both as a strong criticism of the Jesus myth theory. So there was a lot of scholarly people who were claiming Jesus was just a myth, and Conybeare stood up and defended Christianity from that claim that Jesus didn't really even ever exist, making Conybeare a supporter of the historical Jesus. But also he was willing to attack aspects of Orthodox Christianity. And you'll see, even in this reading of what he obviously has sympathy for, is the original message of Christianity, which is that we each are supposed to seek baptism in a certain process, and that would literally involve becoming a disciple of Christ. It's not even an option for you to think you're going to get baptized and you haven't been discipled, and you understand what it means and what Christ commanded, and so on and so forth. So this whole idea of just raise your hand and you're saved and it's eternal secure is just all completely at odds with the way the early church started. And he's going to explain that, and we'll get through that by the end of this episode. Okay, so let's continue. All right, now because most of us have never heard of these ideas before and didn't know any of this history, I'm going to start with his conclusion and give that to you up front, and then that'll help orient you to listen to the facts that support, or you might argue is don't support his claims, but you'll see they do. Let's see what he has to say. In conclusion, let me sum up, as portrayed in the above, the characteristics of this early form of Christianity, adding a few minor touches. That's page 19 of this article. 1. The incarnation was the taking possession of the man Jesus by the Holy Spirit at his baptism in the Jordan. So the incarnation of the Holy Spirit in Jesus did not occur at his birth, the virgin birth, and he instead had that happen at the baptism of Jordan. Now, I just want to go back and show you one book that I forgot to tell you about. He wrote a book in conjunction with Agnes Smith Lewis. Now, Agnes Smith Lewis was the discoverer of the Syriac Sinaiticus. And see, he's saying he's worked with her on that in the Syriac, Arabic, Armenian, Ethiopic, Greek, and Slavonic versions of the story of Ahikar. And Agnes Smith Lewis was involved in that in 1898. Remember, in the early 1890s, she finds the Syriac Sinaiticus, and that's where you see Joseph begat Jesus is in the Matthew version, and there is no virgin birth in the Luke version. Partly damaged, obviously, that could be another explanation, but it would be unimaginable that it would be inconsistent with the Matthew version, which does have Joseph begat Jesus instead of nothing. In fact, in the Matthew version, in the Greek, there's no completion of the 14th generation in Matthew. It just counts that there's going to be 14 generations, and then you get to the 13th generation, it doesn't continue. It doesn't have the finale, and so it doesn't equal 14. So somebody obviously went in and deleted a verse because the writer of Matthew said there's going to be 14 generations in the third group, and it was only 13. And then Jesus doesn't have any begetting. It never mentions how he's begotten in terms of the next step. Anyway, but just wanted to let you know. So he's very much aware that the virgin birth also was something that was added probably around the 140s, 150s. Now let's continue. This, the prime event in Jesus' life, since he was therein reborn as Christ and Son of God, was commemorated in the Epiphany Festival on January 6th. I'm going to pause there. Now, this is unequivocal. If the virgin birth had existed, just to make another point, is nobody would have even have thought of having a festival on January 6th that Jesus became the Son of God at his baptism, right? Because he would have been Son of God at his birth. The virgin birth implies that he was Son of God then. But in the original versions of the Bible, and we'll get into this a little bit more in detail, it says God Yahweh speaks over Jesus' head at the baptism and says, "This day I've begotten you." That means he begot him. He didn't adopt him. He didn't take an eternal son and adopt an eternal being and then adopt him as his son. No, this is somebody who didn't exist as a son of God until God begot him at his baptism at the River Jordan. Let's continue. The same rebirth or regeneration belongs to all who, after repentance and profession of faith in his name or in God, are baptized into his church. I'm going to pause there. So what he's saying is, had we literally just had the simplicity of the way it originally read, we were to understand that we were to undergo the same discipline that Jesus had in his life to live a righteous life. And once we were prepared for that step, to make the step of baptism, we would then, by virtue of the mediation of our the people in our church, we would be born again. That's what the early church did, and that's what they called the Epiphany. And many people waited to the Epiphany holiday each year to have these baptisms all done at that time. 5. Christ was symbolized as a fish because he was born in the waters of the Jordan. Now, just to show you, there's lots of little facts that you need to hear about that. It's very interesting. But he's just now, again, this is his summary. He's assumed you've already heard it all, and I've not gone through it yet with you. But that I'm also going to make this article available for download. If you go to my description, you can download the article he wrote in 1899. 6. When this original significance of the baptism began to be lost sight of, this symbol disappears from the monuments. Jesus comes to be regarded as having been Christ and God from his mother's womb, from the virgin birth. So he's very aware there's a problem there, but he's not going to go into it, just ignoring it. And the belief in the miraculous birth becomes all important. So that idea of the virgin birth also is driving out the Epiphany. So there was a double, the virgin birth creates syncretism, meaning a coronation that's in line with pagan beliefs. And I know you don't like to hear that, some of you, but that's exactly what it does. Is the Zeus Apollo religion had a virgin birth from Apollo himself. One of his sons is born by a virgin without his procreating powers. And so that's the example that, would be something that a scholar like Conybeare would know about. You might not know about it because you're not pagan. You're not familiar with paganism today of that era. Anyway, let's continue. Let's begin over. Jesus comes to be regarded as having been Christ and God from his mother's womb, and the belief in the miraculous birth becomes all important. The mother of Jesus becomes the mother of God, the Theotokos. Okay. Number 7, with the spread of this later view of the incarnation, we must associate the invention of the modern Christmas on December 25th. So if you really look at what he's saying overall, is this view of the incarnation, the virgin birth, combined with the fact that there was the disappearance and the pushing away of the original text, which is that God, Yahweh, speaks over Jesus at the baptism and says, "This day begotten thee," you end up with the invention of the modern Christmas on December 25th. So that's its purpose, is what he's trying to say. It was to drive out the original view that was in the Gospels and had to be erased, which they didn't get erased. They still existed there in 382 when Bishop Faustus confronts Augustine and says, you cannot believe in Matthew and Luke and the Nicene Creed at the same time. We'll get into that later. And so you have to either be a Matthean and Lucan follower, or you will be following a false message that is in the Nicene Creed. So he was pitting these two against each other, and Augustine got the last laugh because his buddy Jerome got rid of the passages in Matthew and Luke in 405 AD in Latin. And then over time, the Greek texts were all made to conform to those changes, getting rid of this day begotten in the baptism account. So words of Yahweh have been removed from the Bible you trust and assume is the way it was originally delivered by the apostles. And no, it no longer is true, unfortunately. At the same time, the old Epiphany feast loses its significance as the commemoration of the spiritual birth of Jesus Christ and becomes the feast of the Magi and their visit to Bethlehem. So he's regretting, he's saying how regretful we've ended up where now the old Epiphany feast, the original approach of the church to the message of Jesus Christ about his baptism and that God Yahweh spoke overhead his head saying, "This day I begotten thee." We no longer understand being son of God is something that we all should want to experience. Son or daughter, I should add, is something we all should aspire to, and that was the whole intention of Jesus. And yet, because you've crowded that all out by the virgin birth, and then you've done the deletion of the text, and then you've also brought in the December 25th emphasis on the virgin birth, and that Jesus did not become son of God. Later in time, he was born son of God at the moment of birth, instead of later, as it was depicted in the original Gospels, as it occurred at his baptism. Let's continue. All right. Now, this next one is very interesting to me because I was raised as a boy, as a Catholic, altar boy, a sleepaway camp, and learned, all about, getting confirmed and all the steps you do. There was this period known as Lent that you were supposed to avoid eating certain foods in that period of time for 40 days. But I never thought, what's the purpose of the 40 days? And you'll hear now, what was that original purpose in the early church? Now, just want to be clear, I've been a Protestant Christian ever since I was 14 years old. So that's been my whole life. And I'm in my late 60s now. So that's where my real thought and heart has always been since age 14. But I still remember the Lent concept and the 40 days. I think sometimes you would go without fish or something. I can't remember you'd fast from certain foods. And this is what it says. The 40 days fast called Lent originally followed directly upon the feast of the baptism, meaning Epiphany, and naturally so, since it commemorated the 40 days passed by the Lord in the wilderness. So Jesus had to go in the wilderness and get tested first. And we all should realize that God uses tests to see if we really love him with our whole heart, mind, and soul. And that's what Jesus did. He allowed himself to go through a 40-day fast. And there it was from apparently all food. And that allowed him to be tested. And he passed the test. Then that is something that he's going to explain. This is replicated now in the way you bring someone along to be baptized. They should first be tested and go through a fast, then they're prepared to be baptized. See, so this is why I just want to bring this out. This is attested by Isaac Catholicos in his summary of the Paulician doctrine. Remember, Conybeare really loves the Paulicians. I've told you this is something he mentions repeatedly. He's very familiar with them. In Combeficius's History Monotholitarum, and by Cosmas Indicoplustes. According to the former source, this custom lasted for 120 years in the church. So in the early church, this idea of 40 days of fasting before you, or some sort of deprivation, like Jesus went through, testing period, you would, after that 40-day period, then you could come forward for baptism. When Epiphany lost its original significance, when Jesus becoming Son of God at his baptism, when Yahweh says over his head, "This day begotten thee," when that's lost its significance and disappeared, the virgin birth is now crowding it out. And then, of course, you have the message of basically the Nicene Creed spelling it out. You can't have you have to have an eternal Son of God, and that can't be possible, and keep the baptism account the way it read. And so in 382, Bishop Faustus destroys Augustine by proving, hey, it's in Matthew and Luke, and then Augustine gets the last laugh, because in 405 AD, his friend Jerome obviously was the one who got rid of it in the Latin Vulgate. Both passages disappeared. When Epiphany lost its original significance and the Jewish Paschal feast was, now that's the Passover feast, was with the suppression of the Decimani. So the Decimani were those people who believed we should keep the Passover feast every year. As Jesus had said, "Do this in remembrance of me." He was talking about this at the Passover feast that he had celebrated. And so it was anticipated we wouldn't do it at a weekly term. We would do it every year at Passover. And this was the original church's approach. And so they were called the Quartodecimans, which means 14 in Latin. The 14ers, you could say, like the 49ers, who would be the 14ers, believed that we should keep the 14th day of a particular month. And that would be in conjunction, therefore, with the Jewish people. And we would celebrate Passover at that time. But when Epiphany was lost and the Jewish Paschal feast it's suppressed, get rid of the 14ers. We're not going to do anything in common with the Jews. This was Constantine's direct orders at the end of Nicaea in his letter to the bishops summarizing the results. One of the results of the Nicene Conference wasn't just that now Jesus is a God, but it was also that the Christians could no longer worship in any conjunction with the Jewish people. That not only erased Sabbath as something we would follow any longer, but it had the immediate effect of changing the day of the observance of the Passover. It would change it to be the day of the goddess Oestre, Easter in Gaelic, or Osiris, Ostara in other language types. So this Easter has many pronunciations, but that's what we call it in the British countries, Easter. But that's the name of a goddess. So we were all being pushed clearly in a syncretism to get us in sync with pagan religions and observances and days. And it was thereby transformed into the Christian Easter, which you all know now. Completely pagan title. It's amazing that we tolerate this kind of thing. God says, don't even utter the name of a pagan god in worship with me. Lent was moved forward. So now what happened is Lent went from being before your baptism. It now went forward in time, and that would be celebrated on January 6th. Now went forward in time into the Lenten season, which would be more in the March-April period of time. so that the fast terminated with Easter Eve. And so it would be coordinated now to end on the day before the Easter celebration of what used to be known as Passover, which used to be actually observed in conjunction with the date the Jewish people were using, which was the 14 of such and such a date. I think it's 14th day of Nisan. So that was what they were fighting for. But, of course, Constantine ruthlessly expunged any view that you had to have keep any festival in common with the Jewish people, and you should now disavow any connection with them. No more Sabbath worship, no more uh, worship on the quarterdeciman day, the 14th day of Nisan. You're going to worship on the day of the vernal, I think it's the vernal equinox. Okay. And this next one should be very interesting to all of us. After the example of Jesus, Christians of the primitive caste I have described were baptized in their 30th year. Now, remember, Jesus was said in the book of Luke that it was approximately on his 30th year that these events occurred, where it leads to his baptism in the River Jordan with John the Baptist. So the church came to conclude that then that is really God's program, is that when we reach maturity at level at that point, we are prepared now to become sons or daughters of God. Paul of Samosata prescribed this age. This is in this text he's citing. The Paulicians, remember, he loves the Paulicians, this group that loves only Paul, basically, or follows Paul, described by Isaac Catholicos, follow the same rule. So they also would do their this primary Paul group. They were also doing their baptisms at the time of their 30th year of age, which is also insisted on by the Key of Truth. And I read you the title of a book called Key of Truth, and I think that's Armenian Church. The Baptist Syrians north of Mosul still follow this rule. So as of 1899, Mosul, which we know it's a famous city that was involved in all the attacks, I think it was in Iraq, back in the Iraq-U.S. war, they were Baptist Syrians in that country, and they practice baptism only on the 30th year of your age. Interesting. So you would be prepared and disciplined, and then after all that discipline, you would be baptized, and you become a son of God. That's the idea. Next, 11. The creeds must once have mentioned the baptism of the Lord, and I suspect that in the Apostles' Creed there originally stood the following clauses. Quote, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Ghost, born in the Jordan through baptism, suffered, etc., etc. It is not without significance that the Albigensian form of the creed retains such a mention of the baptism, and that the Armenian baptismal creed does so likewise. All right, now I'm just going to give you a preview of what's going to come up next. We're going to go and review where does this prophecy begin, and it begins with Psalm 2. I will declare the decree. Yahweh has said unto me, thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen of thine inheritance, the Gentiles, as your inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. So this is God talking to someone about being a begotten son. This day I've begotten him. He's going to beget somebody as his son. And when that happens, he promises he's going to make him a king. And it follows all the elements of Jesus, just so you know. Now, Matthew and Luke, before 405 AD, when Jerome or whoever is in charge of editing the Latin Vulgate, they're going to take out the word this day or today I have begotten thee at the baptism of Jesus, because it's just going to disappear, even though it's in all the texts beforehand. But it's important to know it was there in the first place, and why it's central to Christianity, because this is another proof that Jesus is the Messiah, because God Yahweh speaks over his head at a baptism in front of multiple witnesses and saying, this day I begotten thee, quoting Psalm 2, verse 7, right there, this day I begotten thee. If you remove that, you then have destroyed a prophetic fulfillment of this passage, so that people could know that even Jesus is the Messiah. So the virgin birth not only removed the Davidic heirship of Jesus as the Messiah, which he has to be through a paternal line according to Numbers chapter 1 and Numbers 2. You count through the paternal line. It says that you count it by the house of the father. You don't count it by the mother. That's just the way it was. And there was no way Jesus could be deemed a Davidic heir through a woman. It's just not the way it works. It has to be through the linear line of the male line. For whatever reason, God's wisdom, that's what he decided. But most importantly is this whole plan of God depends upon there being some way you would know it's fulfilled some prophecy. And there, you have to understand the word Messiah in a prophetic sense only appears in this passage and in one other place, and that's in Daniel 9:25-26. That's it. The word Messiah is not used in a prophetic sense at all, except in these passages. So God Yahweh deliberately picked these words out of here, gave them in the first place to David, and then Yahweh, speaks them from heaven so we would know Jesus is the Messiah. And yet by deleting them, how do we know? And by deleting, and the virgin birth takes away, he even has a Davidic lineage through Joseph. So everything was done to destroy the fabric of Christianity, that you can't even prove Jesus is Christ anymore, the way the Bible has been restructured by people who are trying to syncretize us with paganism. So anyway, we're going to get into that, and then we're also going to study, there was a interchange, it's still preserved, right, in the Augustine's writings against the Manichaeans, against the Donatists, at CCL 2020 in book 23 at 313. So this is something you get online. And Faustus challenged Augustine and said, "Hey, Augustine, you're the Bishop of Hippo, but you claim that the Nicene Creed is valid, but if you believe in the Nicene Creed, you can't follow Matthew. You can't believe in what Luke teaches because you're contradicting it. Because Jesus is not an eternal Son, as the Nicene Creed said. He became the Son of God at the baptism." So we'll get to that in the next episode. I just want to leave you with one more explanation of this. Adam Clarke, famous Methodist commentator, Christian, Protestant, and he talks about the eternal Son doctrine in the Nicene Creed, and he says it makes no sense to say Jesus was the eternal Son, begotten of God, as was developed at Nicaea, and thereafter was always, he says, a contradiction in terms. As Adam Clarke, a Methodist, explained in his commentary, quote, "It is demonstrated that the doctrine of the eternal sonship of Christ is absolutely irreconcilable to reason and contradictory to itself. Eternity is that which has no beginning, nor stands in any reference to time. Son supposes time, generation, and father, and time also antecedent to such generation. And therefore, the rational conjunction of these two terms, son and eternity, meaning an eternal son, is absolutely impossible, as they imply essentially different and opposite ideas." All right, so I hope that gets you thinking going forward. The Nicene Creed cannot be true. It's impossible. Begotten, not made. They're in contradiction to each other. You've studied the Nicene Creed. It says Jesus both begotten and not made at the same time. It makes no sense. Just so we have to get back to a Christianity that's from Christ, based on his words, and based on restoring back the message of the fact that everybody has to become a son of God, child of God, by virtue of study and discipleship under the message of Jesus Christ. And when you're prepared, and the people who have spiritual lives, hopefully, know when you're ready to take that step and become a child of God in that sense, then that's when you do it. You don't do it beforehand. You can't be given a false illusion that you're saved by just simply saying prayers over you and making you recite things that don't show any understanding of what it means to be truly a follower of Jesus. What does it mean? And we've lost all sense of that. We just believe it's just to believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And again, as James says, the demons believe, but they're not saved. That's in James chapter 2, if you don't know where that is. All right. So look forward to that. I hope you look for that. That'll come out maybe tomorrow as well. All right. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.